All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Filsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael. We're dedicating all the Shimon Roshos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Habalin Latova, Stephen and Wendy Drazen, in honor of their parents, Israel Drazen, Dina Drazen, Aline Rosenzweig, in memory of Stanley Rosenzweig, from the Bracha. A week of learning sponsors, Abby and Joe Hirsch, with appreciation to the share the entire Kihila, and for the Chayalim, and the schus of the Chayalim, and all of those sacrificing for Klal Yisrael. And Maish and Devorah Wordesheim, our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, creation of the yard site of Aryeh Leib ben Yosef. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas Labin Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those in the Refuah Shavon, together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, so the Baruch Hu Shemir Hashem bring home our hostages b'shalom and b'karov, allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol Maaseh Yedeim. We'll say with that, let us begin. Baruch Hashem, we have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Mem Beis. Today's daf is Mem Beis, and we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Mem Aleph Beis 41b, and we left off the Ein Safek Motzi Midei Vadai, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, about 15 lines up from the bottom. So I'll say, remember again, in yesterday's daf, we made a fascinating distinction between finding broken pieces of what we call slumim versus finding broken pieces of what we call avoda zara. What's the difference between those two terms? Slumim are images. Images, maybe they were worshipped, maybe they weren't worshipped. Avoda zara was definitively worshipped. Halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says that if you find pieces of avoda zara, essentially you can't get hana from them. Why not? Because again, there's a suffix. What's the suffix? Did an akum decommission them or not? That's our shayla. Now, an akum, and we're going to discuss this more in today's daf, an akum does have the ability to decommission avodah zara, but it has, now again, then we have machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Do you need active decommissioning, or can it even be passive decommissioning? But again, we'll get back into that in just a little bit. That's our overarching machlokes over here. Rabbi Yochanan says it has to be active decommissioning. Reish Lakish says even passive decommissioning. Nafka mina would be if the idol falls over by itself and breaks. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's still an idol. According to Reish Lakish, it has lost its idolatrous import. So we'll say, but again, so that's why if you find pieces of an avodah zarah, it's still asur. If you find pieces of a slumim of an image, it's going to be mutter. Why is it mutter? Because there's a svek sveka. What's the svek sveka? Suffix number one is maybe it was never worshipped. That's number one. And number two, ultimately, again, even if it was worshipped, maybe it was decommissioned. So the idea, jumping back to avodah zarah for just a second, the reason why ultimately, again, by avodah zarah, it does not work is because halacha l'maisa we say ein safek motze midei vadai. Ultimately, again, the suffix that maybe it was decommissioned doesn't go ahead and take it out from the vadai that it was avodah zarah. So now the Gemara questions that principle. Vein safek motze midei vadai. Is that true? That a suffix, a possibility, cannot go ahead and change the reality when facing a certainty? What about following Vahatanya? Very interesting. We actually saw this. Chaver shemes v'niach megurim alei peros. So I'll say Chaver died. Chaver died. And again, we translated. I have to give a special shalom aleichem to a member of our shir from South Africa by the name of Ian Meltzer, who I was just introduced to through Mel Ram, another member of our shir in Toronto. Baruch Hashem, we have a beautiful chaver, not just in the space medrash, but Baruch Hashem around the world. So Ian messaged me via Mel. I translated chaver a few days ago as a Talmud Chacham. So the truth is, it's not really a fair definition. Rashi, if you remember again, 2 days ago, goes ahead and translates chaver as a person who is careful with the laws of Tum and Tara to the point that he even eats his chulin b'tara. He even eats his chulin b'tara. So even what we'll call non-sanctified food, he is makbid to eat in a state of ritual purity, and he's also careful with trumas and maestros. No, that's the definition of a chaver. So it's interesting. Rabbi asked, he said, why do you call a chaver? Right? Chaver means a friend. Means, friend, what's the pshat of that? So perhaps the yisod is like this. Who's a chaver? A chaver is someone who is just looking and searching out for extra tara in this world. He's looking for extra purity. That's what he's looking for. At the end of the day, what does Chalish Baruch Hu demand? Well, Hashem says, I want you to make sure that you eat kodesh in a state of tara. Chulin, you don't have to eat in a state of tara. You're not obligated to eat your unsanctified food in a state of ritual purity. A chaver is someone who thirsts for tara so much that he seeks out those standards even in areas where ultimately he's not obligated. Such a person who is thirsting for purity, such a person who wants to bring purity into areas of his life where even he's not obligated to do so, such a person is a friend of the Ribono Shel Olam. That's a friend. Hakadosh Baruch Hu says, someone who wants me in their life so badly that he's willing to take on strictures in areas of ritual purity, dafkan tara, that he doesn't have to, that's a chaver. That's a friend of the Ribono Shel Olam. Perhaps even to a certain degree, a higher level than a Talmid Chacham, because the acquisition of knowledge is enjoyable, is inherently enjoyable. It's beautiful. We all love learning. We all love exploring new ideas. But someone who mamish puts upon himself additional stringencies because he wants tara, dafka tara, he wants purity, that's a friend of the Ribono Shel Olam. So the Gemara says, Chaver shemes v'iniach megurim alei peros. So Chaver dies. Interesting case. Chaver dies, and after he dies, they discover that he has a basket of fruit. What's the issue? We'll say the issue is we don't know whether or not they've been tithed. So the Gemara says, Afilu heim b'nei yomon, even if mamish just harvested them that day, harehim b'cheskas mitukanin. There's a chazaka, ultimately again, that they are properly tithed. The Gemara says, but 1 second. Devadai tvili safek asrinu, safek lo asrinu. But we'll say, let's analyze this case. Here's a case of a vadai. What's the vadai? The certainty. The certainty was they were tevel. That's for sure, right? Tevel's untithed produce. But we'll say, why is that a vadai? Because everything starts out as untithed produce. So you have a vadai that it was untithed. Safek, maybe the chaver did tithe it. Maybe he didn't tithe it. And what do you see from here? And what do you see from here? That ultimately, again, a safek, the possibility that he tithed it, goes ahead and overrides the vadai that it certainly was tevel. So you see safek mosi midei vadai, to which the Gemara says, no. Hasam vadai. It's fascinating. No, it's not true. That's not a safek and vadai. That's a vadai case. What's the case? The vadai asrinu. So Gemara says it said that it was tevel. Vadai was tevel. Certainty that it was tevel, and also vadai. That's what that he tithed it. The Gemara says Rabbi Chanina choza chazaka al chaver she'eno motzi davar she'eno mituka mitachas yado. Both say that's the chazaka. So again, interestingly enough, it's fascinating with the chaver. Both say again. Can you imagine moving yourself to the level where there's no suffix that you've done the right thing? You have to understand this, right? What does that mean to get to that level where the halacha looks at me and the halacha says, this guy certainly did the right thing? A chaver does not leave untithed produce in his possession. From the moment it comes into his possession, it's tithed. And therefore, there's no suffix in vadai, there's only vadai and vadai. Incredible. V'baisim, the other possibility is, the Gemara says, safek v'safeku. Interestingly enough, really it's a safek and a safek. How so? What does that mean? Afshar the avad kid Raboshia. It's possible that the chaver conducted himself like Raboshia. What's the Raboshia? The Amar ma'arim adam al tvu also umachnisa b'motz shala kedei shetei behemta ochela subtura min ha'maiser. I suppose that is an interesting case. There is, technically speaking, a meiser loophole, a tithing loophole. What's the tithing loophole? Without getting into all technicalities now, in order for produce to be subject to tithing obligations, there has to be what's called re'iyas pnei abayis, right? It has to come into the home, through a normative entrance. Technically speaking, if you were to bring your produce in, let's say through the window and not through the door, technically it's meiser exempt. Now again, there are limitations on that also. So the Gemara says over here, there's really no safek motzi midei vadai. Why? Because it's actually possible, even if you want to go with the fact that maybe it's a safek if the chaver tithed it or not, it's also a safek if what? If the produce was ever subject to Trumas and Maestros. Why? Because it's possible that literally, again, he used this legal loophole of bringing it in through the window, and therefore it was never subject. Okay, so the Gemara says, one second, so remember, the Gemara is questioning this principle, right? The Gemara put out there like a law, a principle. The principle was, Ein safek motze midei vadai, right? That ultimately, again, a possibility cannot change the reality of a certainty. So the Gemara says, really, is that true? So the Gemara says, Vatanya, we learned, Rabbi Yehuda, Ma'aseh b'shiv chasal shel matz, top of Membeis. Ma'aseh b'shiv chasal shel matzik echa berimon. Very interesting case where there was once a story of a maidservant. I will say now, again, we're going to, this is a Jewish woman, right? A Jewish woman who worked for a matzik. What's a matzik? Rashi says over here, Gavra Alama v'Yisrael. A very powerful guy. Very powerful guy. She worked for a matzik in the city of Rimon. Okay, what happened? She had a miscarriage. And I will say, interestingly enough, it was common that when a woman had a miscarriage, you have to bury a nefel. But interesting, the halacha is, this has also evolved a little bit. They would put a nefel in a pit, in other words, in a nondescript grave. In general, both said the halacha is you have to bury a nefel, you have to bury a miscarried baby, but we dafka do not bury it in a marked grave. We do not do that. We have to bury it in the ground, but we do not bury it in a marked grave for a variety of reasons. Also, just from a mental health perspective, it is unhealthy. The Chazal said it is unhealthy for parents to develop an ongoing attachment to a life that never was. Obviously, again, there's trauma, there's loss, there's grief, but Chazal wanted it to be contained, did not want it to be an ongoing life loss. So what happened? So she miscarried, and she put the miscarriage in a pit. Uba coin hits it. A coin came along, and obviously saw what had happened, and peered over the pit. Now, why did the coin peer over the pit? Leida im zachar im nekeva. So he was going to have to paskin for her. Now, I'm going to say when a woman gives birth, and even after a miscarriage, depending on when the miscarriage occurred, there could be tumas leida. There could be ritual impurity associated with birth. Now, the duration of tumas leida depends on what? Boy or girl. So the coin peers over the pit in order to see, was the nefel, I guess it was developed enough, to see whether or not it was a boy or a girl. Now, what's the problem over here? The problem is, by peering over the pit, what did the coin essentially do? Tumas ohel. Tumas ohel. Remember again, tumas ohel abosai could be contracted in two ways. You could be under a roof together with a mace, or you could be the roof over the mace. So technically speaking, if there's a corpse, let's say again, I'm standing next to a corpse underneath the sky, but I lean over the corpse, I am the ohel. So here the coin went ahead and leaned over the pit to see, is it a boy or a girl? And what happened? This episode came from the Chachamim. And they were retire him. Why would they retire the Kohen? Because ultimately, again, this was a place where there were weasels and animals there, and the reality is they probably took the miscarriage. They probably took it and dragged it away somewhere. Immerse 1 second. The Vada Hetila Nefel, Safek Garuhu, Safek Lo Garuhu, the Kaasi Safek Umosimi de Vadai. Suppose you look at this case over here. Here's a case of Vadai. What's the Vadai? The shivcha, the woman had a miscarriage, and she placed the baby in the pit. What's the safek? Maybe the animal took it, maybe the animal didn't take it. And yet, what do we see from here? The Gemara says, and yet we see that the safek trumps the vadai, right? The safek changes the reality even in the face of the vadai, to the point that, again, they paskin, the kohen is not tameh. The kohen is not tameh. So you see from here that safek can go ahead and trump a vadai. To which the Gemara says, no. Lo teima hitila labar, nefal labar, ela ema, hitila kimin nefal labar. The Gemara says, no. What happened over here is the Kohen sees the shivcha throwing something that looked like a nefel. In other words,
It's not a vadai that she miscarried and placed a nefel in the bar. Rather, again, he saw what appeared to be a nefel being placed in the bar by this woman. So it's a suffix to begin with. The Gemara said, 1 second, but that's not what it says. But the Gemara said that he dafka peered over in order to see if it was a boy or a girl, to which the Gemara says, Hachi Kama, that's what it means to say. Leida, the Gemara says, Leida, imruach epila, im nefel epila. So first of all, he was looking into the pit to see what did she miscarry. Did she miscarry again? And did she miscarry a baby? Or again, Abba say, ruach hapila just means maybe she just expelled something else from her body. In other words, lav dafka, that she expelled a miscarriage. Maybe it was just something else. It was some other discharge. See, he was first of all looking over the body, see, was it an ephel or not? And if it was an ephel, to see if it was a boy or girl. So in fact, this wasn't the case of vadai and suffix. Rather, again, this was a case of suffix and suffix. So again, suffix whether or not she miscarried a baby, right? What was it a miscarriage or not? And then again, compound that with the suffix, ultimately again, that maybe the animal took it away. The other possibility is, the other possibility is no. Once you have a place where you know that there's a chulda and a bardalis, that there are these animals there, they definitely dragged away whatever was expelled into the pit. Okay, so we'll raise the kasha. So again, we'll pause over here for just a second. So just understand, the Gemara essentially seems to say that principle of ein safek motze midei vadai ultimately again holds that in halacha we accept this principle, ein safek motze midei vadai, that if you have what we'll call two pieces of information in front of you, one is a safek and one is a vadai, the vadai piece of information determines the reality, and the suffix piece of information does not undermine that reality. That's why I both say, again, just kind of reorienting ourselves a little bit. That's why, how did we get into this? I find a piece of broken Avoda Zara, right? So I find a piece of, let's say, an idol or an image that I know was definitely worshipped as idolatry. So now I find the piece, can I use it? Can I use it? So the answer is no. Why not? It's Asr Ba'ana. Why? Because I have a vadai that this was Avoda Zara. Safek, maybe the akum actively decommissioned it. And therefore, again, I can't use it. Why? Because the safek, that maybe the akum decommissioned it, doesn't change the reality of the vadai that this was definitely Avoda Zara. And I both say, just to point out how powerful this yisod is on a hashkafic level as well. Because in safek motze midei vadai, if you want to go ahead and summarize the entirety of Jewish history and destiny into one phrase, this is it. Over the years, right, over the millennia, we have faced so many sfekos. Right? Will we survive? Is this an existential threat? Is all of this, say it was so interesting. It was so interesting that those of us who were zocha to be here on Shabbos after Rav Asher Weiss, he said, the Rav said so many beautiful things, but one of the things I felt that was like very shocking was he spoke about in the aftermath of October 7th, feeling an existential threat to Klal Yisrael. So to me that was shocking, because for me, in my mind, I said to myself, there was never an existential threat to Klal Yisrael. Right? It was scary, it was overwhelming, but obviously, Rav Asher Weiss says it, and he's an Eretz Yisrael Jew, it takes on a totally different thing. And over the centuries, there's been many sfekas, right? We've faced many moments of existential suffix. Are we going to make it through this? Are we going to weather this storm? Just less than a century ago, they put us in ovens and in gas chambers. There was a suffix. So what holds us over? What holds us over is this principle. Ein suffix motze midei vadai. What's the vadai? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Am Yisrael is an Am HaNitzchi. Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, we are an eternal nation. That's the vadai. And therefore, what holds us over even in times of difficulty? Ein safek motze midei vadai. suffix, whether that suffix is the Babylonians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, the Nazis, Hamas, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who the suffix is. There are so many sfekas that have presented themselves. Shabachol dar vadar, another suffix, omdim aleinu l'chalosin, another suffix always arises. But rest assured, in suffix motzi midei vadai. No suffix could undermine the vadai, the certainty of the eternality of Klal Yisrael. That's ultimately, again, the source of our optimism. That's the source of our strength, and that's what creates our reality. Incredible. Incredible both halachically as well as hashkafically. So now the Gemara goes back. Esvei, so says, remember again, embedded in all of this is this machlokas we have between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So here's what I know. And again, we're going to talk about this more in just a few moments. You can decommission an Avoda Zara, right? In other words, an akum could be mevatel his Avoda Zara. The shaila is, how does he do it? Rabbi Yochanan says it must be what we call active bittul, and Reish Lakish says even passive bittul works. So now going back to that a little bit. Esvei, ovid kochav mevatel avodas kochav shalav v'shal. Listen to this. And we're going to see this in the Mishnah later on as well. I'm sorry. Did I skip? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Esvei matzatav nisyad tav. Thank you. Matzatav nisyad v'tav nisragel hare elu asun. So we'll say back to the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? If you find the image of a hand or image of a foot, ultimately again it's asur. It's asur. So the Gemara says, Mipnei shekiyotze bahen ne'avad. Why? Because at the end of the day, that was a common image that people worship. The Gemara says, Amai. But why is that? Hashvarim ninhu. So we'll say that's broken pieces. So in other words, once again, this is a kasha on Reish Lakish. This is Rabbi Yochanan asking on Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, according to you, this should be totally mutter, right? Because according to Reish Lakish, once you find broken pieces, whether the akum actively broke it or whether the idol broke on its own, an akum doesn't worship an idol like that anymore. Again, also always Reish Lakish's logic. Idol, if you can't save yourself from being broken, then chances are what? You're not much help to me. You're not much help to me. And therefore, again, so what's going on? The Gemara says, no, Shmuel al basisan. So as I remember again, this is what we said yesterday. What's the case? The case of the hand and the foot is the case ultimately where it's on a pedestal. When it's on a pedestal, then that is quite possible that is actually a almost like not self-sufficient, this is the wrong word, but its own type of idolatry. Okay, Gemara is another kasha. It's very interesting. So we'll see more of this later. An ovid kochavim can be mevatel his own avodah zara, and ultimately again the avodah zara of his friend. Meaning, any akum can ultimately again negate and thereby decommission any form of idolatry, whether it's his idolatry that he worships or someone else's idolatry. However, the Yisrael, I will say this is actually quite fascinating, and we'll see the logic behind this. An ovid kochavim, actually, a Yisrael does not have the ability to negate any form of idolatry. I will say, isn't that fascinating? Right? So an ovid kochavim can negate and decommission any form of idolatry. A Yisrael has no power of negation over idolatry. Fascinating. Amar Abaye. So we'll say, so am I to heavy bavalas kamshin ishtar may allow. But why is that? What about a case of idolatry that just breaks on its own? Now, clearly, again, according to Reish Lakish, according to you, that should work. Amar Abaye shepascha. What's the case over here? The case over here is where the Yisrael dented the Oved Kochavim. So we'll say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is suggesting is denting is not a form of decommission. Why not? Decommission requires breakage. Denting, where the entire item is still intact, doesn't decommission. The Gemara says, 1 second. V'chi pascha, my havi, vatnan, pascha, afapi shelo chasra, batla. But that's not true. We learned that, again, if you dent in idolatry, even though, again, all of the idolatrous material is still present, ultimately, again, the Avoda Zara is batal. Hani mili de pascha v'kochavim, ava pascha Yisrael lo batla. Ultimately, again, that is true. You're right. If an akum goes ahead and dents the idolatry, that negates it. But if Yisrael dents the idolatry, that does not negate it. So the Gemara says, Rava says, the Olam Ki paschei Yisrael nami bata. Both say this is a very important Gemara. So Rabbi says like this. In reality, even when a Yisrael dents the Avoda Zara, it goes in negation. In other words, Rabbi say denting really is an active form of negation, which makes sense, right? Anything you do to deface the idol should be a proper form of idolatrous negation. So really, even if a Yisrael dents it, it's okay. So what's the issue? So why did Chazal say that it's not good? Listen to this. Where it says, Ella Gzera. There's a Gzera. What's the Gzera? Dilma Magbala v'hadim mevatala. So I'll say, here's the issue. In reality, a Yisrael has the power of negation, right? A Yisrael does have the power to go ahead and negate idolatry. How does he negate idolatry? If he breaks it, if he dents it, it all should work. So why did Chazal say it doesn't work? What are we concerned about? Listen to this. We're concerned that what is the Yisrael going to do? He wants to negate an Avoda Zara. So what does he do? He has Avoda Zara. He lifts it up, right? Getting ready, let's say, to smash it or to dent it afterwards. What's the problem? Once he lifts it up, Rabbi say, that's an act of Hagbah. What does Hagbah do? Hagbah acquires. Once he acquires it, it becomes the Avodah Zara of a Jew. Once it becomes the Avodah Zara of a Jew, v'havi avodas kochavim biyad Yisrael, v'chol avodas kochavim biyad Yisrael eina betela liolam. So I will say this is absolutely wild. It's absolutely wild. I will say we are going to see exactly why this is. This is a Gemara in 10 blocks from now on Nun Beis. But again, right now we'll just go with the principle. The principle is any Avodah Zara that is owned by a Jew cannot be negated. So watch what's happening over here. Can a Yisrael, technically speaking, decommission Avodah Zara? Yeah. How could he decommission it? He could break it, he could dent it, but Chazal said the decommissioning of a Jew does not work. Why? What are we concerned about? That in the process of decommissioning, the Yisrael is going to pick it up. By picking it up, Avodah Zara is considered to be hefker, and we'll get into all of this in a couple of days. Avodah Zara is considered to be hefker. He lifts it up, he acquires it. Once he acquires, I don't know why I'm modeling Avodah Zara over here, right? Once he goes ahead and he acquires it, it becomes Avodah Zara of a Yid. Avodah Zara of a Yid ultimately cannot be, you can't be mevatel it, you can't decommission it. Therefore, ultimately, we are stuck in this situation. So essentially, what we want to try to avoid is Jewish handling of Avodah Zara. How did Chazal ensure that? By simply going ahead and saying, you can't do anything to it. Even if you try to decommission it, ultimately, it is not going to work. Incredible. So therefore, the Gemara says, Eisvei, akum shehevi avonim min amarkalis, v'chipa bahen drachim v'tartios. So we'll say, just by the way, this whole idea over here of okay, we'll come back to it. The Gemara says as follows, akum shehevi avonim min amarkalis. Listen to this. So let's say you have an akum who brought stones from Markalis, right? What's Markalis? Markalis is an Avodah Zara that essentially the Avodah Zara was a stone formation. So an akum takes stones from Markalis, and what does he do? V'chipa bahen drachim v'tartios mutaros. And what does he do? He goes ahead and he takes the stones and he builds them into roads. In other words, he decommissions the stones by using them for mundane use. He uses them as pavers, right? As pavers, and he uses them to make the street. So what's the halacha? Mutaros. The stones are mutar. Why are the stones mutar? Because again, halacha l'maisa, he's actively decommissioned them through using them for a mundane use. But again, if a Jew takes stones from Markalis and builds it into the road, ultimately, again, it's not decommissioned. You can't use that road. You can't get hana because it's avodah zara. Amai, the Gemara says, but why is that? So why don't we say it? So again, it's Rabbi Yochanan asking Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, why should this be any worse, ultimately, again, than avodah zara that broke on its own? And according to you, Reish Lakish, avodah zara that broke on its own ultimately is decommissioned. To which the Gemara says, no, hachanami kidirava. The Gemara says, just as Rava said before. Rava said essentially, midrabanan, a Jew can't decommission avodah zara. Why not? Because once again, we have this concern. This is Rava. We have this concern that in the process of decommissioning, the Jew's going to lift it up. If he lifts it up, he acquires it. Then it's avodah zara owned by a Jew. And once you have avodah zara owned by a Jew, that can never be decommissioned. Incredible. And again, we'll see if never actually means never. So listen to this. Supposed to hear, watch this. You have an Avoda Zara and you shave the Avoda Zara. So Rashi points out there, for example, an Asherah tree. An Asherah tree, right? And what do? I go and I take shavings off of the Asherah tree. So what's the status of the shavings? So the Gemara says, Litzarcho, if ultimately, and the Akum is doing it for himself, right? He's taking shavings off the Avodah Zarah tree because he wants to, I don't know, make a bonfire, whatever it is. Litzarcho, ultimately, again, if he's doing it for himself, then he, v'shipuyeha mutarin. Then both the shavings and the tree itself become mutter. Why? Because the action of taking shavings off the Avodah Zarah tree for the Akum's own personal use is what? Is itself a decommissioning of the Avodah Zarah. Okay? The Gemara says, however, L'tzarcha, if he's taking shavings off the tree, let's say he's pruning the tree, right? That's for the benefit of the tree itself. So L'tzarcha, hi asura v'shipuyeha mutarin. Ultimately, again, then the shavings and the tree ultimately, again, then hi asura, the tree is still asur, but ultimately, again, the shavings will be mutar. But if Yisrael takes shavings, right, takes pieces off of the Asherah tree, whether the Yisrael is doing this again for his benefit or for the tree's benefit, ultimately, again, the Avodah Zarah, the tree itself, and the shavings remain mutter. So once again, Rabbi Yochanan asks Reish Lakish, Amai tehavi kavodas kochavim shenishtabra me'eleha. Why should this be any different, right? Reish Lakish, according to you, this should be no different than an Avodah Zarah that breaks on its own. And when it breaks on its own, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, you said it's decommissioned. So too over here in this case, it should be decommissioned as well. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami kid Rava. So we'll say once again, we keep on bringing up Rava. What does Rava say? So we'll say again, Rava is of the opinion, essentially, we don't want Jews decommissioning Avodah Zarah. Why? It's too much of a roll of the dice, because if you do it in the wrong way, then what ends up happening? Then halacha l'maisa, you end up acquiring it, and therefore again, it can never be, there's no bittul. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Shochet v'zor l'ruach o matiliam. So this is actually our next Mishnah. Our next Mishnah that we're going to see in Meretz Hashem. So the Rabbi Yossi says, or two Mishnahs from now, Shochet v'zor l'ruach. If you find Avodah Zarah, you could grind it up and scatter it to the wind. O matiliam. Or you can go ahead and throw it into the sea. Now, we're going to see, this is talking about if you find an Avodah Zarah made of metal. So what do? Grind it up, scatter it, right? Scatter it to the wind or throw it into the sea. The Gemara says, Amrulo, afhina asazel. No, you can't do it. Because if you scatter it into the wind, then what could happen? It could become fertilizer. So the Gemara says, Uksiv, lo yidbak biyat chamu'uma, min acherem. And the Pasuk says, really, you can't retain any part of Avodah Zarah for your own use. The Gemara says, but Amai, again, once again, Rabbi Yochanan asking Reish Lakish, Amai, tehavi kavodas kocham shnishtabra me'eleha. But once again, why? Reish Lakish, according to you, this should be fine, because according to you, Reish Lakish, even if Avodah Zarah breaks on its own, ultimately, again, it's decommissioned. So this case of grinding it up should also be a decommissioning. So who cares, even if it does act as fertilizer? It's not Avodah Zarah fertilizer. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami kidirava. Once again, Rabbi say we all roads keep leading back to Rava. Ultimately, again, it was concerned that if a Jew is involved in decommissioning, he may lift it up first, acquire it, and once it's acquired by a Jew, it cannot be decommissioned. Ze'esvei, Rabbi Yossi ben Yisian Omer, Matzot Suras Darkon, Verosha Chatoch. So what's the interesting case over here? Let's say you find the image of a dragon. This is our next Mishnah. Now, we're going to see a dragon as one of those images that was always considered to be idolatrous. So watch this. You go ahead and you find the image of a dragon, but the head is cut off. That is cut off. So therefore, Safek Ovid Kochavim Chatcho, Safek Yisrael Chatcho, Mutter. So if I'm not sure, did a Jew decapitate the dragon, right? Or did an Akum? It's Mutter. It's Mutter. The Gemara says, on the other hand, Vada Yisrael Chatcho, Aser. But if Yisrael was the one who cut off the head, it's Aser. The Gemara says, Amai. But I don't understand, why should this be any different? In other words, it's a suffix case. So why should it be any different than a case, ultimately, again, of Avodah Zarah that broke on its own? Once again, the Gemara says we are concerned, ultimately, again, about the concern of Rava. So we'll say, essentially what you begin to see is a theme over here. We don't want Jews involved with Avoda Zara at all, even with the decommissioning of Avoda Zara. We just want Jews to stay away from idolatry. Therefore, Chazal were machmir to the point that even the decommissioning of a Jew doesn't work, out of concern that he may pick it up, acquire it, and create even greater problems going forward. Eisvei, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Af lo yirakos b'mos hageshamim, mivnei shanavia no sheres bahen. So we'll say, interesting case over here. So this halacha l'maisa is the following case. We're going to see this also. All of these are mishnayos that we'll see later on. The halacha is in general, Bosai, that about what is the halacha concerning planting vegetables underneath an Asherah tree. Underneath an Asherah tree. So during the summer, the problem is that the Asherah tree provides shade, and shade is beneficial, obviously, to the vegetables, to the produce, right? So therefore, you can't plant in the summertime. However, in the winter, the rainy season, ultimately the shade is actually detrimental. So therefore the Gemara wants to suggest, the Mishnah wants to suggest that there's no problem planting vegetation underneath an Asherah tree during the rainy season. Rabbi Yossi says, not true. You can't even plant vegetables underneath the tree during the rainy season. Why not? Because what could happen? The leaves of the tree fall off, and the leaves themselves act as fertilizer for the growing vegetation. So the Gemara says, Amai, but I don't understand why should falling leaves be a problem? After all, once again, Rish Lakish, fallen leaves should be no different than what? Fallen idols. Right? According to Rish Lakish, if an idol falls and breaks on its own, it's batal. So too, if a leaf falls off of the tree, it should also be batal. Shouldn't be a problem of fertilizer. To which the Gemara says, no. Shiny hasam de ikra avodas kochavim kayemes. No, in the case of the fallen leaf, it's different. Why is it different? Because the primary part of the idolatry remains intact. The leaf may fall off, but the tree is fully intact. That kind of endows the fallen leaf with Avoda Zara identity, even after it's no longer on the tree. The Gemara will say, Amid Beis, Men Beis, 42b. The Gemara says, Vaha, Shipuyan. What about the case of the shavings? The Asherah tree shavings, Dikra Avodas Kochavim Kayemes, where once again the primary part of the Avodah Zara, i.e., the tree is still in existence. Vikatani, yet in that case, Rabbi Sai, we said Litzarcha. We said that even in a case, ultimately, again, where you're pruning the tree for the benefit of the tree remains asur. But ultimately, again, the shavings are mutar. Ultimately, I will say for the simple reason, because an Avodah Zara, you can't negate an Avodah, or an Avodah Zara cannot be negated when it is functioning in its normal, natural way. So since it is normal for leaves to fall off trees, that act cannot create a sense of negation or reality of negation, which makes sense. The Gemara says, okay, so up until now, all of these questions have been from Rabbi Yochanan to Reish Lakish. So remember again, on both sides, Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish focuses on one simple case. An Avodah Zara falls over by itself and breaks. Is the Avodah Zara batal or not? Rabbi Yochanan, no, because negation of idolatry requires active negation. Reish Lakish, yes, because even de facto negation, right, or passive negation ultimately works. So up until now, this entire Amid has been Rabbi Yochanan questioning Reish Lakish. Now we switch gears. Eisir Shemen Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. So Reish Lakish asked the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Here we go. What's the interesting case here? If you have a tree, now the tree belongs to Hektish, right? The tree belongs to Beis HaMikdash. Now what happens? There's a nest on top of the tree. So birds made a nest on top of the tree. What's the halacha? Lo nanin v'lo mo'alin. You really should not get benefit from the nest, but if you did so, you have not committed me'ilah. Now we'll say so again. Rashi says over here, second line from the top, lo nanin, das midrabanan. So you can't get benefit, midrabanan, v'lo mo'alin, right? But obviously, again, the nest itself is not considered to be part of the tree, and therefore, if you did get benefit from the nest, ultimately, again, it's not me'ilah. Fine. So the Gemara says, let's analyze. But Barosha Shel Asherah, what about if the nest is on the top of an Asherah tree? So same case. I have an Asherah tree. On the top of the Asherah tree is a bird's nest. I want to get benefit from the bird's nest. So what could I do? Yatiz bakana. So what can you do? Knock down the nest. Ultimately, again, with a piece of wood, and therefore you could go ahead and get benefit from the nest like that. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, Yatiz bakana. I'm sorry. Rabbi Shmuel Yatiz bakana. Kasach adaitcha kigon shenishbar mimeno eitzim vikin sabah. Now we'll say, here's what's interesting. Okay, so this is very interesting. So now, again, what can't I do? I can't, in both cases, I can't climb the tree in order to get to the nest, right? Because climbing the tree is usage of the tree. But with the Avoda Zara tree, interesting enough, what can I do? Just take a piece of wood, knock down the nest, and get benefit from the nest. Now, the Gemara says, let's say that what is the bird building the nest from? Now, the assumption over here is the nest on the Asherah tree is being built from wood or from twigs from the Asherah tree, right? And yet, what does the Gemara say? You can get benefit from the nest. You can't scale the tree, but you can get benefit from the nest. But that nest is made from broken pieces of the Asherah tree. What do you see from here? That once Avoda Zara breaks, right, even on its own, even though it has not been actively broken, it's decommissioned. So the Gemara says, the assumption over here is that the bird is building its nest from twigs, broken pieces of the Asherah tree. The katani yatiz bakana, and yet the nest is mutter. So Hirsch says, this supports my assertion that broken Avoda Zara, even if not intentionally broken, ultimately decommissions the Avoda Zara. Excuse me, the Gemara says, no. What's the case? Not necessarily. That's not necessarily how birds make nests. In other words, birds make nests. Birds make nests in trees all the time, but they often bring materials from other locations. So the case over here is the bird made itself comfortable in the Asherah tree, but it did not gather the materials or the nest from the Asherah tree. Rather, it gathered the materials ultimately, again, from elsewhere. Dekanami diktani gabi hektish. So we'll say, so again, what's the raya for that? The raya for that is look at the hektish case. What happened in the hektish case? In the hektish case, we'll say, what do the Gemara say about the bird's nest, or about the bird's nest? Lo nanin, or about the tree. About the nest, sorry. Lo nanin v'lo mo'alin. So again, you should not get benefit from the nest, but if you did, you did not commit me'ilah. So the Gemara said, well, let's analyze this. Say if we're talking about a case where the bird built the nest ultimately again from materials in the veldt, right outside of the hektish tree, then hainu diktani gabi hektish lo nanin v'lo mo'alin. So then it makes sense. Lo nanin midrabanan. So again, Chazal said, we really don't want you to get benefit from that nest, right? Why not? Because it's attached to a hektish tree, and we can see how accidentally you may come to scale the tree. But it's midrabanan, and also v'lo mo'alin midoraisa. But there's no me'ilah. Why is there no me'ilah? Because since the materials for the nest came not from the hektish tree, but from the outside, the nest itself is not subject to me'ilah. But again, about say, if halacha l'maisa, the bird is building the nest from the tree itself. That means, again, if this nest is made from twigs from a hektish tree, then what's the status of the nest? The status of the nest? It's hektish. If it's hektish, ultimately, again, then you're not allowed to benefit from it, midaraisa, and it's mi'ila midaraisa, to which the Gemara says, so therefore the Gemara is suggesting, it seems to be clear that halacha l'mais, we're dealing with both cases in the Asherah tree and in the hektish tree, where the bird is making a nest from other materials, not from the Asherah tree and not from the hektish tree, to which the Gemara says, not necessarily. The Gemara says, midi area, hacha bigidulin haboyin la'achar mikana askinon. So we'll say maybe not. It's actually quite possible that in both of these cases, ultimately, or I should say in the hektish case, that the bird is making its nest from the actual hektish tree itself. But if the bird is making its nest from the hektish tree, then why is that nest not aser mid'oraisa? Right? What's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, listen to this. The Gemara says, what's the case over here? So Rabbi say, this is a fascinating sugya which we'll get to. when you're makdish something, right? So obviously the item as it is hegdish. What about if that item grows things afterwards? Are those subsequent growths considered to be hegdish as well? So what's a great example of this? A tree. I'm makdish a tree, on Tuesday. And then 3 months later, there's Baruch Hashem, there's new branches, there's new growths. Are those new branches and growths subject to the hektish designation or not? That is a machlokes. That is called gidulin haboin la'achar mikan. Growth which occurs after the designation. So the Gemara, maybe we're talking about over here is the bird. So again, I was makdish the tree, and then again, 3 months later, when new branches grew, the bird took twigs from the new growths. And I made the nest out of those new growths. And therefore, again, so now is the nest hagdish? It depends. That's a machlokes. The Gemara says, "V'kasavar ein me'ila begidulin." And the author of this brayso, or the author of this Mishnah holds that Allah Lamaisa, the hektish designation only devolves upon the tree that's in existence at the time of the designation. But anything that grows afterwards is not subject to hektish, and therefore, again, the nest is mutter. Incredible. Rabbi Avo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mayatiz. Ultimately, what does it mean? Rabbi Avo says maybe not. What does it mean when it says you can knock the nest down and get benefit from the nest? Be'afrochin. It doesn't mean the nest. It doesn't mean the nest itself. It could very well be that the nest is aser. The nest is aser in both cases because it's made of ashera or because it's made of a hektish tree. Either way, it's aser. So what's mutter? What can you get benefit from? The chicks. In other words, when we say knock down the nest, what it means is get benefit from the contents of the nest, but not the nest itself. And you could apply that to both cases, both to the Asherah case as well as to the Hektish case. So in both of the cases, ultimately, and perhaps, you can't get benefit from the nest itself, especially if we're setting this up as a case where the nest is being made from the hektish tree or the nest is being made from the Asherah tree. And again, even assuming that the materials weren't present at the time of the designation, maybe we're going like the opinions that whatever grows from the tree is going to be hektish or avoda Zara. So what's the case? So why am I knocking down the nest? Not for the nest material, but rather what? For the chicks or for the eggs inside of the nest, and that will be mutter. That will be mutter. The beitzim kan v'kan asur. Supposed to listen to this. I shouldn't have said eggs. Gemara says for the chicks it's going to be mutter, but for the eggs, ultimately again it's going to be asur. Now, both say, now why are the eggs asur? So this is actually quite fascinating. If you look at Rashi, this is Rashi right before the Mishnah in Rashi. The beitzim kan v'kan asur shetzrichin le'ilan v'gazer bahen rabbanan ka'al ilan asman. So both is actually quite fascinating. Eggs are asur. Why are eggs asur? Because eggs need the nest. The nest needs the tree, and therefore if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, which means that halacha l'maisa, the eggs are considered to be ultimately reliant on the tree. So because of that, they are going to be asur as asur. Isn't this fascinating? So now it's quite possible. Now there's a lot of variables going on over here. But the Gemara is suggesting maybe in all of these cases the nest is asur. Why is the nest asur? Because we're talking about a case where the nest was made from the Asherah tree or from the hektish tree. So the nest is going to be asur. The nest is going to be asur. So what does it mean when the Brisa says take a stick, knock down the nest, and get benefit from the nest? It means the chicks in the nest. The chicks are mutter, but the eggs may be problematic. Why? Because ultimately, again, since the eggs need the nest and the nest needs the tree, therefore the eggs are considered to be dependent on the tree, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the eggs are considered to be an appendage of the tree itself. So you can get benefit ultimately again from the chicks, but ultimately not the eggs. The Gemara says, "Bebeitzim kam v'kan asur." Amar Rashi, "Ve'afrochin shetzrichan le'iman." This is very interesting. Chicks that are so young that they are reliant on their mother have the status of eggs, right? So which makes sense because the chicks that require their mother are dependent on the nest. The nest is reliant on the tree, and therefore halacha l'maisa remain problematic. So therefore, I will say it turns out that over here with this case of the nest on top of the Asherah tree, the hektish tree, you obviously can't scale the tree regardless, right? Whether by Avoda Zara or hektish. What can you do? You can knock down the nest. But why are you knocking down the nest? So really you can't get benefit from the nest because there's a concern that the nest itself was made from the Asherah tree or from the hektish tree. What can you get benefit from? Independent chicks. independent chicks, right? Halach l'may said that is going to be mutter, right? Sorry, maybe better, right? Right, so you get benefit from the independent young birds, right? Or ultimately, but what you can't get benefit from is the eggs or from the reliant young, because those are considered to be dependent on the tree itself. Rabbi say, we'll stop over here for today, but again, let me just say the halach l'maisa. So actually, Rabbi say, yeah, all right, we'll tomorrow, because we're already at tomorrow, we'll pick up, we'll finish off with the halach l'maisa Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Like, what do we do in that machlokes? Who do we paskin like? And then Amiras Hashem will continue. Amiras Hashem, adventures in Avoda Zara. Shkayach, everyone. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day.